All right, so let's go ahead and hop into the first section of my common application personal statement. Getting you here was hard, Jose, but you fight so the next kid doesn't have to. Speaking to me was a vice president for one of the largest Christian youth ministries in the world. We sat in the middle of a camp on an inlet in British Columbia where I'd been serving for the summer. She told me that despite this ministry's immensity, which spreads across several continents and serves millions of youth, I was the first openly gay student ever accepted as a work crew volunteer. When she recounted the many calls that were made after my sexual orientation came to light in my application process, and how close I came to being rejected for it, I was stunned. I knew the organization had some homophobic policies, but never had I realized the stories I saw in the news of discrimination could be a part of my own reality. So this beginning section serves as the hook to my essay, where I open with this phrase that's being said to me of, getting you here was hard, Jose, but you fight so that the next kid doesn't have to. What that does is it immediately grabs my admissions officer's attention because it offers this sort of incomplete picture of what's going on. I'm clearly demonstrating that my presence in whatever this place is, I don't describe it quite yet in that first sentence, but my presence there is important for some reason, and it's not just important for myself, but it's important for other people. And what that does, these admissions officers are really looking to see across your entire application. It doesn't necessarily have to be in your common application, your personal statement, but they're looking to see, what is your influence on others? How do you impact other people? How do you use the forces that you have to do good in the world? And I'm starting to allude to that a little bit, but I'm not giving a complete picture because I want to pull my reader in. I want to entice them by having half-completed details that I will then paint a more full picture later on. This section also serves a purpose by introducing certain important elements to my essay and to the admissions officer reading it that will continue to be explored later. So I begin by talking about how I am at this camp, I'm working at this ministry, so clearly faith is in some ways important to me if I'm working at this camp for the summer. But beyond that, I'm also queer. And it's interesting to see already that one might assume there would be some friction between being queer and being a person of faith. And I validate that by beginning to show an example of where my faith and my sexual orientation have a bit of friction. Now, there are several of the tips that I already mentioned that I begin to employ in this section. Most obviously is the structure, and it's the fact that I have a hook at the beginning of my essay. What that does is it grabs my audience's attention and really keeps them around for the rest of my essay. Beyond that, I employ the show, don't tell principle. I was the first openly queer person to work at this camp. It's a Christian camp in British Columbia, but I don't just say that. Instead, I describe where we were in this camp. I describe who is talking to me. I give some more details on this ministry. But most importantly, I give a lot of detail about myself and how I'm feeling and what I'm thinking. I'm talking about how I was stunned. I'm talking about what I was hearing about these calls that were being made about my sexual orientation. I'm describing my confusion and my surprise as I realized that this organization I knew had some homophobic policies, but I didn't realize that they would impact me. I knew that there was discrimination against people like me, against queer people, but I didn't really realize that I could come to face with it in that moment at this camp. So I really go ahead and I give a lot more detail to really describe what's going on, how I'm feeling, what the circumstances are around me, and that is a great example of how to use the show, don't tell principle. Additionally, I employ the grab attention principle, where what I do is I offer these details through this hook, but also just through explaining my confusion and things like that to grab my admissions officer's attention, because if I'm describing my confusion, they might also be interested as to why I'm confused. They want to learn more. They want to read this essay, spend some time on it, and really be invested in order to understand this story. And I think that speaks to a greater way to write these essays. Of course, there will always be caveats depending on the nature of the subjects that you're talking about, but I think it kind of is a good thing to do to not explain everything right away. You have like 1,500 words to flesh this out. And so you don't need to get to the meat of what you're saying right away. Instead, you can offer some moments for the reader to pause and kind of wonder what's going on by offering incomplete details in order to grab their attention. You might normally think that in order to grab attention, you need to be flashy, you need to show everything that's going on. But that's not necessarily true. A lot of people give their attention because they're curious about something. In an essay where you're talking about, a story or something, that can be a great way of grabbing attention. The other principle that I employ is the, quote, show you're worth fighting for principle, which is that I am going ahead and introducing these important elements of who I am, of my queerness, of my faith, and I'm showing that there is obviously this demonstrated impact on other people, where I'm the first person to be openly queer, openly gay for this ministry, and I'm alluding to the fact that later on it'll be easier for other people to go ahead and do that as well. What I'm also doing is I'm not using my own words in saying that, I'm using this vice president of this ministry's words, because that demonstrates a lot more impact than my own words could have, just because it's coming from another person talking about me. And what's also cool is that this is a conversation that actually did happen. I remember sitting there on that inlet talking with this person. So what I'm doing is I'm showing that I'm worth fighting for by helping to introduce these important elements of me right from the beginning, so that as I continue to hit these details throughout the rest of my essay, it really drives home the fact that this applicant, in this case me, has something that's interesting about them, which is this intersectional identity that leads them to interesting situations in which they do something that helps others. And so that will help really show that I'm worth fighting for, because it just kind of helps create this narrative that my admissions officer can remember and then later refer back to as they are going before committee and things like that. Now let's go ahead and hop into the next section of my personal statement. I exist on the borders between opposing and overlapping worlds, where my sexual orientation crashes into my faith and my Mexican heritage intersects my American upbringing. Many people may see this statelessness as condemning me to the life of a wanderer who slipped through the cracks of society. However, I regard myself as situated at the crossroads, where the privileged and disadvantaged intersect. My background and experiences have given me the ability to bridge these long-lasting divides through focusing on commonalities with others in order to foster empathy, even though it's hard. I'm less like a wanderer and more like a cartographer who every day sets out to chart the terrain around me so as to develop paths for others to move from one place, cultural, political, or spiritual, to another. So these paragraphs serve a purpose of zooming out from that initial story that I share, where I talk about how I'm the first queer person to volunteer for this organization in the position I was in. Then I go ahead and provide a bit more of my own thinking by talking about how I regard myself and my identity more broadly beyond just this specific situation. Additionally, I kind of use a thesis statement here. This is where my so what statement is. I say that essentially the rest of my essay is going to be about my intersectionality. I devote this entire paragraph to talking about it, so it's clearly pretty important. I certainly have a lot of different identities, and a lot of people might think that they don't really go well with each other, and I myself might even think that. But because I'm able to sort of see a lot of different perspectives and reconcile a lot of different ways of seeing the world and interacting with it, just because I need to reconcile that in order to make sense of myself and make sense of how I see the world, I'm able to connect with a lot of other people and help people relate to one another and focus on empathy with one another. And I even recognize that it's difficult. In this section, I also begin to use a lot of the other suggestions that I already mentioned. I use a lot of descriptive language. I use words like opposing and overlapping, crashes, condemning, bridge. And I certainly use the show don't tell principle, because I bring in this cartography metaphor to illustrate my identity and how I see myself. This cartography metaphor is also something that I'll continue to use throughout my essay. And so we'll be able to kind of track how I see myself by how I use language in order to describe the situations that I find myself in as I continue to employ this metaphor throughout the rest of my essay.